One of the most common defenses for those who argue there was no conflict between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in Europe is the fact that no fossil evidence of conflict exists. But what if the famous skull of Saint-Césaire was not a gracile female Neanderthal, but a Homo sapiens male whose skull was smashed in a violent raid by some of the last Neanderthals? 42,000 years ago was a time of rapid environmental instability that would have had devastating short-term consequences for human populations in Europe, and would lead to conflict for limited resources and prey at a time when two very different populations occupied the landscape. The bones from Saint-Césaire do not lie quietly. They do not rest in anatomical order, do not sit beneath a carefully prepared floor, do not speak the language of burial or reverence. They are smashed. The stone tools around them are smashed too. Nothing about the assemblage suggests time, care, or ritual. It suggests interruption, force, an ending that came suddenly and without ceremony. For decades, this has been treated as an unremarkable footnote to a familiar story. A late Neanderthal individual, often described as female, associated with Châtelperronian tools, living out the last flickering moments of a fading population. The story is comforting because it is tidy. Neanderthals linger. They imitate. They vanish. The smashed bones are written off as taphonomy, sediment pressure, roof collapse, the dull background noise of deep time. But that story depends on something rarely stated outright, that Saint-Césaire must be Neanderthal. If that assumption is loosened, not rejected but interrogated, the site changes character, and the implications become chilling. Saint-Césaire has always been an awkward fossil. The cranium is extremely fragmented. The occipital region and the left half of the skull are missing. The cranial base is absent. The face is incomplete. The most taxonomically decisive parts of the skull, the ones that usually anchor confident classification, simply are not there. What remains is robust, large-brained and male-coded in proportions far more than traditionally acknowledged. Claims of Neanderthal identity rest heavily on inference, on reconstructed facial projection, on assumed occipital morphology, on dental traits that overlap broadly with early Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens. This is not unique. The same elasticity haunts reconstructions of Amud Cave in the Levant, whose skull can look profoundly Neanderthal or strikingly sapiens-like depending on which traits are emphasized. And Amud, in turn, overlaps uncannily with School 5, a specimen universally accepted as Homo sapiens despite its heavy brow ridges, robust vault, and archaic proportions. Once School 5 is allowed to define the lower, more rugged boundary of Homo sapiens, Saint-Césaire no longer sits safely on the Neanderthal side of a line. It drifts into a shared morphospace, a zone occupied by large, cold-adapted male individuals whose anatomy reflects deep hybrid ancestry rather than clean species separation. This is not radical. It is consistent with genetics. Early Upper Paleolithic Europeans, especially those tied to the Bacho-Kiro-Châtelperronian groups, carried substantial Neanderthal ancestry, in some cases far more than later populations. They were Eurasian sapiens, already shaped by long contact, admixture and selection. A school-grade, Bacho-Kiro-related sapiens male in Western Europe around 42,000 years ago is not an anomaly. It is exactly what the genomic record predicts. Once Saint-Césaire is allowed to be sapiens grade, the archaeological context becomes impossible to ignore. However, the most chilling evidence lies not in the stone tools, but in the condition of the bones and the camps in which those bodies once fell. These sites show the unmistakable signature of trauma. Perimortem fractures, disturbed skeletons, missing skull vaults, separated jaws, scattered vertebrae, broken ornaments, overturned hearths, and pulverized cultural layers. It is a record of conflict. And because these sites are so tightly clustered, only a day's walk apart, the same pattern unfolding across them within the same 200-year window cannot be explained by coincidence. It is the archaeological fingerprint of a population being overrun. The small rock shelter of Saint-Césaire is the center of this discussion. The partial skull discovered there was once heralded as the proof that Neanderthals made Châtelperronian tools. But beneath the interpretations lay a darker truth, one that only became fully visible when modern stratigraphic analysis stripped away the romanticism. The layer in which the skeleton was found is not intact. It is not a burial. It is not a neat occupation floor with stable hearths and orderly living debris. The sediment is churned, twisted, collapsed, and savagely disturbed. The skeleton itself appears scattered across a displacement block, a jumble of bones caught in a layer that had been broken and reworked before the archaeologists ever touched it. Long before the soil entombed the remains, something had already broken the site. When the skull fragments were reconstructed, the picture became even more disturbing. One part of the cranial vault, when subjected to digital analysis, revealed a lesion whose morphology matches a blow inflicted with a sharp, blade-shaped weapon. The cut penetrated the bone deep enough to fracture the internal lamina. The individual may have survived initially, but it was the kind of injury sustained in interpersonal conflict. Not in a fall, not in accident, not in the inert collapse of sediment. The blow came from an angle indicating intention. Whoever struck this individual did so deliberately. When the rest of the skeletal remains are considered, the missing vault pieces, the displaced mandible, the scattered ribs, the absence of anatomical articulation, the picture becomes one of a body that died not in peace but in chaos. This skull is one of the most important pieces of evidence for brutal displacement during the extinction window. The site around the body is equally unsettling. The Chattelperonian tools found nearby are not whole. Many are broken, snapped at the midsection, fractured as though stepped on or smashed. Ornaments are truncated, pierced teeth broken at the apex, bone awls snapped or crushed. Hearths that should form clear thermal halos appear overturned, their stones dislodged, their surrounding sediments blended and compacted. Microstratigraphy reveals trampling and reworking. It is a scene that resembles not a domestic flaw but an interrupted one. Something happened here. Something forceful enough to change the structure of the sediment, scatter tools, break ornaments, and leave a wounded individual to die in the rubble. The skull tells another haunting story. When a body decomposes in situ, the skull tends to collapse inward as the soft tissues rot, leaving certain predictable patterns. At Saint-Césaire, the skull does show signs of collapsing in place, but the sediment around it had already been disturbed before the skull decomposed. This means that the head did not lie in a prepared grave or even a stable living floor. He or she may have fallen, been dragged, or been thrown down during or after a brutal encounter. The surrounding bones show no careful placement, no funerary treatment. The site is not a cemetery. It is the archaeological echo of a destabilizing event, meaning the head may have been cut off or separated from the body. This matters because taphonomic explanations work best when damage is random. Here, damage is patterned. Human bone and cultural material are treated similarly. There is no strong carnivore signature, no gnawing, no digestion, no clear evidence of long exposure. What we see instead is what archaeologists recognize cautiously as high-energy disturbance. High-energy disturbance does not automatically mean ruthlessness. Roof collapses happen, trampling happens, but those explanations grow weaker when multiple categories of material show comparable breakage and when no later occupation repairs, rearranges, or memorializes what was left behind. The site does not look like a home that slowly decayed. It looks like a place that stopped being a home. Neanderthal populations were regionally entrenched, familiar with their landscapes, and under increasing demographic pressure. Incoming sapiens groups, whether newly arrived or long-embedded hybrids, brought different mobility patterns, different technologies, and different social networks. This was not a gentle overlap. It was a contact zone. Ethnography offers no comfort here. When closely related human groups compete for the same resources, conflict is often personal, not abstract. Raids are not grand battles. They are fast, localized, and brutal. They leave little material signature beyond disruption, broken bodies, broken tools, and silence afterward. At Saint-Césaire, the combination of trauma on the skull, the disturbed deposition, the broken tools, the smashed ornaments, and the chaotic sediments paints the clearest picture of terror. He or she died during a moment of turmoil. Whether in the heat of a raid or the aftermath of one, her body did not receive the care that Neanderthals often afforded their dead. The skull's collapse in situ suggests the head remained on the ground as the soft tissues decayed. The surrounding disturbance means the body may have been moved, trampled or manipulated after or during death. The missing fragments of the cranial vault and the scattered ribs are consistent with a scene in which multiple bodies or multiple objects were moving across the ground at the time of deposition. If Saint-Césaire represents a sapiens-grade individual present within a sapiens-associated occupation, then the lack of burial takes on a new meaning. Burials are acts of belonging. The absence of burial can signal annihilation. And lone warrior killed in conflict is rarely afforded ritual care. This does not require ideology. It requires only fear, competition, and proximity. There is no evidence at Saint-Césaire for projectile trauma or distant killing. There are no embedded points, no healed defensive wounds recorded on preserved bone. What there is fragmentation, the kind that happens when bodies are handled roughly, when force is applied after death or during the final moments of life. That kind of conflict is intimate. It happens at arm's length. If a raid occurred, and it must remain a hypothesis, it was likely small. A few individuals, a sudden encounter, perhaps at dawn, perhaps in retaliation, the kind of conflict that leaves no monuments and no stories, only broken remains pressed into sediment. The smashed tools matter here. Tools are not collateral damage in roof collapses. They are collateral damage in events, in struggles, in flight. Calling this a last battle is tempting. It fits a dramatic arc. Neanderthals fighting for survival against encroaching sapiens, a final stand, a tragic end, but that framing is misleading. If Saint-Césaire was a school-like hybrid, then this was not sapiens versus Neanderthal in the way textbooks imagine. It was one branch of a shared Eurasian population confronting another, with boundaries already blurred by gene flow. The killer and the killed may have looked strikingly similar. They may have shared technologies. They may even have shared ancestors within a few thousand years. That is what makes the scenario colder, not warmer. Aggression between near equals is often the most intense, because identity is fragile where similarity is high. Being almost the same can be more threatening than being different. This interpretation is uncomfortable, not because it is sensational, but because it disrupts two deeply held narratives at once. First, it challenges the idea that late Neanderthal Europe was a peaceful space of gradual acculturation. Second, it undermines the moral asymmetry often imposed on the past, where sapiens are explorers and Neanderthals are relics. If Saint-Césaire was sapiens grade, then sapiens were not only innovators and survivors. They were also participants in close-range rage, long before agriculture, states or ideology. That should not shock us. It should humanize the past. The site Archeological reinforced this picture, though in different ways. The final layers become more chaotic, with scattered bone and stone, and then disappear entirely. The occupation surface is not worn out by gradual long-term use, it simply stops. At Archeological, the celebrated Grotte du Renne contains Châtelperronian ornaments, many of which are broken. Pierced animal teeth show fractures at their suspension points. Ivory elements appear snapped, bone awls are broken. The layer reads like a space abandoned suddenly, before the occupants could clean up, bury their dead properly, or escape with their toolkit intact. Forensic analysts studying the spatial patterning note that the artifacts seemed trampled or jumbled, as though multiple disruptive episodes occurred in rapid succession. Some researchers argue that these breakages are due to natural sediment pressure, but the distribution of fragments and the condition of the layers suggest a more complex history, one that again involves disturbance. The question becomes unavoidable. Who destroyed these camps? To answer that, one must summarize the synchrony of dates. At Saint-Césaire, the occupation layer is assigned to nearly the same interval. The Châtelperronian of Arcy-sur-Cure disappears in the same region of the radiocarbon curve. This tight synchronicity is not scattered across millennia. It is compressed into a couple of centuries, at most 300 years. In archaeological time, that is not a slow disappearance. That is a coordinated destruction. In southwest France, the Neanderthals had been holding on to the last patches of habitable territory. The sudden appearance of Châtelperronian tools and occupation layers immediately above the disrupted Neanderthal-Mousterian levels suggests not a long coexistence, but a rapid displacement. None of this can be proven beyond doubt. Archaeology rarely offers certainty. What it offers are patterns, absences, and contexts that resist easy explanations. What is certain is that Saint-Césaire is not a clean fossil. Not anatomically, not archaeologically. Its skull is incomplete. Its context is disturbed. Its classification is more fragile than often admitted. What is also certain is that Europe, around 40,000 years ago, was not a quiet place. It was a mosaic of populations negotiating space, identity, and survival in real time. In that world, conflict was not inevitable, but neither was it rare. The most important question is not whether Saint-Césaire was killed in a raid. It is this: how many other sites have we explained away as taphonomy, because the alternative would force us to confront the full overlap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens? The combined archaeological evidence, trauma on the Saint-Césaire skull, the broken ornaments, smashed tools, overturned hearths, disturbed floors, and abrupt abandonment points toward brutal encounters. What form did this take? The evidence does not permit precise reconstruction, but the patterns align with small-scale raids or confrontations. Neanderthal communities were small, often at the scale of extended families, especially hybrid groups. Homo sapiens' expansion into the region during a period of ecological stress would have put direct pressure on Neanderthal territories. The archaeological record in France captures the final outcome conflict. It shows the destruction of camps, the scattering of the dead, and the arrival of another population in their place. A span of 2 centuries is all that separates the flourishing of Châtelperronian groups in this region from their total disappearance. In human terms, that is not the slow extinction. It is the brutal end of a people. And the sites tell the story with forensic precision. The battered skull at Saint-Césaire, the fractured ornaments at Arcy-sur-Cure, the overturned hearths at Les Cottes, the missing vault fragments, the scattered vertebrae, the chaotic deposition, the absence of burials, all aligned within the same tight range of radiocarbon dates, all clustered in the same geographic corridor, all marking the same extinction pulse. The archaeological record of southwest France 42,000 years ago shows a sudden destruction of Châtelperronian groups. This destruction is best explained by conflict. Brutal hand-to-hand combat is the more parsimonious explanation for the trauma, site destruction, abandoned floors, and immediate cultural replacement seen across the Charente-Dordogne corridor. At the centre of this picture stands Saint-Césaire, who died from a sharp force blow to the head, a weapon strike, not an accident. The remains lie in a disturbed, churned, broken layer filled with smashed Châtelperronian tools, truncated ornaments, overturned hearths, and displaced bones. The skull collapsed in place as it decomposed. Yet the sediment around it was already disturbed, implying the body lay on a floor shattered before or during death, possibly dragged or manipulated. This context matches the signature of a raid or attack, not an internal dispute. The same pattern occurs at Les Cottes, where Châtelperronian disappears abruptly around 42,000 years ago. At Arcy-sur-Cure, the Châtelperronian ornament layers are smashed, truncated and disturbed. The trauma at Saint-Césaire fits Neanderthal close-range combat, not Homo sapiens long-range weaponry. Every site shows one final chaotic layer, broken, overturned and disturbed, followed by modern humans a few thousand years later. There is never a return of Neanderthals afterward. The timing is decisive. The destruction horizon aligns perfectly with the arrival of modern humans in Western Europe. Later, modern humans arriving with larger populations, broader alliances, and long-range projectile weapons held every strategic advantage. Neanderthals, fragmented into small, isolated groups, could not withstand coordinated pressure, and this led to conflict between groups. The archaeological signatures, trauma on the Saint-Césaire skull, smashed ornaments, disrupted campsites, and abrupt abandonment, are best explained by Mousterian Neanderthals brutally displacing Châtelperronian Homo sapiens during a scramble for territory. Taken together, the evidence forms a single, coherent conclusion. The final interaction of modern humans and Neanderthals in France was not peaceful.